Hey guys, tonight we're not just stepping back in time. We're shouldering our way through a crowded, smoky room. The air thick with the scent of spilled ale, damp wool, and history in the making. We're venturing into the heart of colonial American life, the Tavern. Picture this outside, but a rough-hewn wooden building. A flickering lantern swinging above a crudely painted sign. Perhaps a snarling lion or a serene swan. The only beacon of light and warmth on a dark, muddy road. Inside, the murmur of voices, the clinking of pewter mugs, the thump of a dice cup, and the hearty laughter of men and women finding respite from their arduous lives. This was the Colonial Tavern. Far more than just a place to grab a drink. It was the newsroom, the post office, the community center, and sometimes the very stage upon which the drama of a new nation was beginning to unfold. But for all its vital roles, you probably wouldn't survive a night in some of these establishments without a cast-iron stomach, an ability to sleep soundly next to complete strangers and possibly their livestock, and a very, very forgiving palate when it came to the house specials we're about to explore. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're all tuning in from tonight. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always a true pleasure to see how far these sleepy historical rambles reach. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself on a dusty, rutted road somewhere in colonial America, perhaps in the bustling port city of Boston in the 1760s, or a quieter crossroads village in rural Pennsylvania a few decades earlier, or maybe even a remote outpost on the Carolina frontier. The era spans from the early 17th century settlements right up to the eve of the American Revolution. As twilight deepens, or perhaps as a biting wind urges you towards shelter, you see it, the welcoming, if somewhat rustic, glow of the local tavern, ordinary, or inn the names were often used interchangeably, though tavern generally emphasized drink, inn lodging, and ordinary food at a fixed price. Colonial American taverns were absolutely vital. Social, economic, and political centers in their communities, serving a multitude of functions far beyond just providing food, drink, and a place to sleep. They were, in many ways, the glue that held scattered colonial settlements together. Let's approach the exterior. It's likely a sturdy wooden structure, perhaps 2 stories high, with small paned windows that offer only tantalizing glimpses of the warmth within. There's a hitching post out front for horses, maybe a rough bench or two where patrons might gather in warmer weather. The most distinctive feature is often the tavern sign. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that these signs were crucial for identification because a significant portion of the colonial population was illiterate, or at least not fluently literate. So, instead of relying on written names, taverns were known by their pictorial signs: the Green Dragon, famous in Boston as a meeting place for revolutionaries; the Red Lion; the Ship; the King's Arms, though that one might have become less popular in certain circles after 1776. Or perhaps something more whimsical like the Cat and Fiddle. These images, often brightly painted and creaking in the wind, were the logos of their day, instantly recognizable landmarks. You didn't ask for directions to John Smith's public house. You asked for the way to the Sign of the Prancing Pony, hoping it wasn't too far and that their ale wasn't too watered down. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, you step into the main public room, often called the tap room or common room. The immediate sensations are a rush of relative warmth if the fire is well stoked, a cacophony of sound, and a rich tapestry of smells. The light is dim, supplied by flickering candles made of tallow animal fat, giving off a distinctive, slightly greasy odor or more expensive beeswax. Oil lamps burning whale oil or fish oil, adding their own unique aroma to the mix. And, most importantly, the great hearth. The fireplace is the heart of the room, often large enough to roast an entire animal, though that was for special occasions. Its flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls and low-beamed ceiling. The air is thick with wood smoke, some of which hopefully finds its way up the chimney, but much of which seems to prefer lingering at head height, mingling with the sweet, pungent scent of pipe tobacco smoked by men, and sometimes women, the yeasty aroma of spilled ale, and perhaps the savory smell of a stew simmering over the fire if food is being served. Add to that the general human miasma of a room full of people who bathed, let's say, less frequently than we do today, and you have an olfactory experience that is uniquely colonial. You definitely want to make sure your own personal hygiene standards weren't too jarringly modern, or you might be the one smelling out of place. The furniture is sturdy and utilitarian. Long trestle tables, rough wooden benches, three-legged stools. Perhaps a few more comfortable settles or wingback chairs are drawn up close to the fire, likely occupied by the more prosperous or assertive patrons. The floor is bare wood, or perhaps sprinkled with sand or sawdust to absorb spills and other things. Don't look too closely. And the people. The clientele of a colonial tavern was often a vibrant cross-section of society, though predominantly male. You'd find local farmers discussing crop prices or the weather, artisans hashing out a contract, merchants negotiating deals over a shared tankard of cider. Travelers, weary from the road, would be seeking a meal, a drink, and a bed for the night. Sailors on shore leave might be boisterously recounting tales of the sea. Soldiers, if there was a garrison nearby, might be off duty and looking for camaraderie. Local militiamen might gather here for drills or discussions. And increasingly, as tensions with Great Britain grew in the 18th century, men would gather to discuss politics, to read aloud the latest pamphlets or newspapers from Boston or Philadelphia, to debate the meaning of liberty and the injustices of taxation without representation. The tavern was the crucible of public opinion. Beyond being a drinking establishment, the tavern served as an unofficial post office. Letters might be left with the innkeeper for collection or forwarding. A news exchange. Travelers brought news from other towns and colonies, or even from across the Atlantic. A place for auctions and business transactions, and sometimes even a makeshift courthouse where a traveling magistrate might hear local cases. Public notices were often posted here. It was where you went to find out what was happening, to see and be seen, to feel connected to the wider world, or at least your corner of it. The tavern keeper, mine host or publican, was a key figure. He, or sometimes she, as widows often took over their deceased husband's licenses, was not just a purveyor of drink and lodging. They were a conduit of information, a local power broker, a confidant, and sometimes a very shrewd business person who knew everyone's secrets and everyone's creditworthiness. Their ability to provide good drink, passable food, and a reasonably well-ordered or tolerably disordered environment was crucial to their success. Goodman Parker's ale is as thin as his excuses for the lumpy mattresses. A traveler might grumble, making a mental note to try the Bluebell on his next journey. Historians still debate the precise degree to which taverns in different colonial regions eat the more stringently regulated Puritan New England versus the more boisterous southern colonies or frontier settlements, actively fostered or, in some cases, attempted to suppress early revolutionary sentiment in the lead-up to the American Revolution. While some taverns were undeniably hotbeds of patriot activity like Boston's Green Dragon, others remained loyalist strongholds, and many probably just tried to cater to all paying customers without getting their windows smashed. It was a complicated business, being a publican in revolutionary times. So, as you find a place on a crowded bench, the warmth of the fire beginning to seep into your bones, the murmur of a dozen conversations creating a comforting, sleepy hum, you're at the very heart of colonial American life. And at the center of that heart, both literally and figuratively, was the beverage. What people drank, how they drank it, and why they drank it, tells us a huge amount about their daily lives, their resources, their fears, and their pleasures. The drinks menu, had such a thing existed in written form, would have been very different from today's. And that's precisely what we're here to explore. Those forgotten beverages, those strange and wonderful concoctions that once flowed so freely in these smoky, firelit rooms. But first, we need to understand why water, our modern go-to for hydration, often took a backseat to more spirited alternatives. You're now settled into the convivial, if somewhat hazy, atmosphere of a colonial American tavern. The fire crackles, the conversation hums, and pewter mugs are being refilled. Before we dive into the specifics of what those mugs contained, it's worth pondering a fundamental question that might seem strange to our modern sensibilities. Why weren't these colonial folks just drinking water? We tend to think of water as the default, the healthiest, the most natural choice for hydration. But in colonial America, as in much of the pre-modern world, H2O often came with a host of hidden perils and a reputation that was, shall we say, less than sparkling. Understanding their cautious, often suspicious relationship with plain water is key to appreciating why alcoholic and fermented beverages played such a dominant role in their daily lives and in the offerings of every tavern. It wasn't always about seeking intoxication. Often, it was about seeking safe, reliable, and even nutritious hydration. Let's consider the water supplies available to the average colonist in the 17th and 18th centuries. In rural areas, they might rely on springs, streams, rivers, or shallow hand-dug wells. In more populated towns and cities, wells would be more common, but so would the sources of contamination. In the colonial period, due to often unsafe or unpalatable water sources and a profound lack of understanding of waterborne diseases and germ theory, fermented beverages like cider and beer were commonly consumed by people of all ages, including children. As a perceived safer and more nourishing alternative to water, think about it, there were no modern sanitation systems, no water treatment plants, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. Human and animal waste often found its way into the very water sources people drank from. Privies' outhouses were frequently located alarmingly close to wells or streams. Tanneries, slaughterhouses, and other small colonial industries might dump their waste products directly into rivers. Agricultural runoff carrying animal manure could contaminate surface waters. The result, water that might look clear but could be teeming with invisible dangers, leading to a host of debilitating and often deadly diseases. Dysentery, the bloody flux, typhoid fever. Cholera, though major cholera epidemics were more a 19th century scourge. The bacteria were around, and various other intestinal ailments. Colonists knew that drinking water from certain sources, or at certain times of the year, could make them violently ill, even if they didn't understand precisely why. They associated bad air or miasmas with disease, but the water itself was often the culprit. That water from Miller's Creek gave young Timothy the colic again. A concerned parent might say, "Best stick to the small beer, son, until the creek looks less suspiciously green." Even if the water wasn't actively trying to kill you, it often wasn't very pleasant. It could be brackish if drawn from wells too close to the coast. It might be heavy with minerals, giving it an unpalatable taste or a murky appearance. It could be full of sediment, algae, or decaying organic matter, especially if drawn from a slow-moving stream or a pond. The idea of a cool, clear, refreshing glass of pure spring water was often more of an ideal than a daily reality. The term Adam's ale was used for water, sometimes affectionately, but often with a sense of it being a rather thin, unexciting, and potentially untrustworthy beverage compared to the more robust and reliable character of fermented drinks. One colonial wit even referred to water as that pauper's drink, not exactly a ringing endorsement. This is where fermented beverages like cider and beer came to the rescue. The process of fermentation itself, involving yeast consuming sugars and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide, had a couple of key benefits. Firstly, the boiling of water often required in the brewing process for beer, at least would have killed many harmful microorganisms, even if the brewers didn't understand the germ theory behind it. They just knew that brewed water was generally safer. Secondly, the alcohol produced, even in low concentrations as found in small beer or mildly fermented cider, had a preservative effect, inhibiting the growth of some spoilage bacteria. And thirdly, these drinks weren't just liquid. They contained calories from the residual sugars and starches, and some B vitamins from the yeast, making them a source of nourishment as well as hydration. In a world where daily caloric intake could be precarious, especially for laborers, a few mugs of cider or small beer throughout the day contributed to their energy needs. The social acceptance of drinking these mildly alcoholic beverages was widespread. It wasn't seen as a vice, but as a normal, healthy part of daily life for men, women, and often children. Children wouldn't be knocking back strong spirits, of course, but they would routinely drink small beer with an alcohol content often less than 1%, akin to some modern non-alcoholic beers or ciderkin, a very weak cider made from repressing apple pomace with water. These were considered safer and more wholesome than potentially contaminated water. This daily, moderate consumption of alcohol was simply part of the cultural wallpaper, a practice brought over from Europe where similar water quality issues had prevailed for centuries. The idea that water was the primary, healthy drink for everyone is a much more modern concept, tied to advancements in public sanitation and scientific understanding. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some colonial town records and personal journals occasionally include ordinances or remarks about the need to protect specific water sources, or regulations about waste disposal near wells or streams. This indicates an empirical awareness that certain practices could lead to bad water, even if they didn't fully grasp the microbiology. They might not have known about E. coli, but they knew that if the privy was uphill from the well, people tended to get sick more often. There were even occasional attempts to create rudimentary public water systems in larger towns like Boston or Philadelphia, using wooden pipes to bring water from supposedly cleaner springs, though these were often fraught with their own problems of leakage and contamination. The extent to which colonial Americans consciously chose alcoholic beverages primarily for their perceived safety over water versus their caloric content, their more appealing taste compared to often unpalatable water, their mood-altering effects, even mild ones, or simply deep-seated cultural habit brought from Europe, is a nuanced question that food historians and social historians continue to explore. It was likely a combination of all these factors. Water was a gamble. Cider and beer were familiar, generally reliable, and part of the expected daily provision. So, when you stepped into that colonial tavern, the array of alcoholic beverages on offer wasn't just about revelry or escapism, though those certainly played their part. It was also about providing something that people considered a safe, necessary, and even healthy part of their daily intake. The perilous Potomac potion, or the dubious Delaware drip, was often best avoided if a tankard of cloudy, home-brewed ale or sharp, tangy cider was on offer. The tavern, in this sense, was providing a vital public health service, even if its patrons were more focused on quenching their thirst and catching up on the local gossip than on avoiding waterborne pathogens. And it's this fundamental preference for something other than water that sets the stage for the diverse and often forgotten array of beverages we're about to sample. Having established that colonial Americans often viewed plain water with a healthy dose of suspicion, preferring the perceived safety and sustenance of fermented beverages, we now turn our attention to what was arguably the most ubiquitous, most democratic, and most quintessentially American drink of the colonial era cider, long before baseball and apple pie became national symbols. Cider, in its various forms, was flowing freely from farmsteads to taverns, quenching the thirst of colonists from New England down through the mid-Atlantic and beyond. The apple tree, it turns out, was one of the most successful early immigrants to the New World, and its fermented fruit became the colonists' faithful companion. Let's take a slow, sleepy wander through the colonial apple orchards and cider presses to appreciate the reign of this humble yet mighty beverage. The apple, while not native to North America in its cultivated forms, crabapples were indigenous, but not ideal for eating or large-scale cider production, took to the American soil with remarkable enthusiasm. European settlers brought with them seeds, cuttings, and grafting knowledge, and apple orchards quickly became a common feature of colonial farms, particularly in the northern and middle colonies where the climate was well suited. Unlike some other European crops that struggled to adapt, apple trees thrived, producing bountiful harvests. This wasn't primarily about growing crisp, sweet dessert apples for hand-eating, as we might imagine today. Many of the colonial apple varieties were spitters, tart, tannic, and often rather unpalatable fresh off the tree, but absolutely perfect for making cider. Their complex flavors and higher sugar content, which translated to higher alcohol, made for a superior fermented product. The legendary figure of Johnny Appleseed. John Chapman comes much later, in the early 19th century, but the groundwork for America's love affair with apples and their fermented juice was laid by these early colonial orchardists. Every farmstead with a bit of land aimed to have its own apple trees, ensuring a ready supply of the raw material for their favorite drink. It was like having a personal, self-renewing beverage source right outside your door. Another bumper crop from Old Spitzenberg and the Roxbury russet. A farmer might declare with satisfaction, "Looks like we'll be well hydrated and pleasantly buzzed through the winter again." Cider was the most popular alcoholic beverage in much of colonial America, especially in regions like New England and the mid-Atlantic colonies. Due to the widespread abundance of apples and the relative ease and low cost of its production compared to beer, which required cultivating and malting grains, and often scarce hops or wine, which faced significant viticultural challenges. For many families, cider wasn't just a beverage, it was a staple, a form of liquid currency, and a vital part of their domestic economy. The making of cider was an annual autumn ritual, a communal activity that brought families and neighbors together. After the apples were harvested, shaken from the trees, gathered from the ground, they would often be left to sweat for a period, allowing them to soften and their flavors to develop further. Then came the crushing, or milling. Early methods involved pounding the apples in wooden troughs with heavy pestles, or using a simple stone mill turned by hand or by horse. The resulting apple pulp, or pomace, was then transferred to the cider press. These presses varied in design, from simple lever presses to more sophisticated screw presses, often ingeniously constructed from wood. The pressure would squeeze out the precious juice, which would be collected in wooden tubs or barrels. The smell of fresh apple juice, sweet and tangy, would fill the autumn air, a promise of the cider to come. Children probably hovered around, hoping for a taste of the sweet, unfermented juice, a seasonal treat before it began its journey into something more potent. Once pressed, the apple juice would be transferred to wooden barrels, typically stored in a cool cellar or outbuilding, and left to ferment. This was usually a natural fermentation, relying on the wild yeast present on the apple skins and in the environment. No carefully selected champagne yeast here. It was a more rustic, unpredictable process, but one that generally worked. The fermentation would convert the sugars in the apple juice into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The length and vigor of the fermentation would determine the cider's strength and character. Several types of cider were produced. The most common was hard cider, the fully fermented, alcoholic beverage that was the daily drink for many. Its strength could vary considerably, from a relatively mild 3 to 4% alcohol by volume to something much more potent, perhaps 7 to 8% or even higher. Depending on the sugar content of the apples and the thoroughness of the fermentation, it was typically tart, sometimes a bit cloudy, and often had a distinct cidery or appley tang, quite different from the highly filtered and often artificially sweetened ciders popular today. Then there was sweet cider, which was essentially fresh apple juice, or juice that had only undergone a very short, partial fermentation, leaving it with a lower alcohol content and more residual sweetness. This was more of a seasonal drink, enjoyed in the autumn shortly after pressing, as it wouldn't keep well without further fermentation or much later pasteurization. And for the servants, laborers, or children, there was ciderkin, sometimes called water cider. This was a much weaker, very low alcohol beverage made by adding water to the already pressed apple pomace, and then repressing it to extract any remaining sugars and flavors. It was a way to get every last bit of utility from the apple harvest, a thin but still refreshing drink that was considered safer than water. "Don't hog all the hard stuff, lads," the farmer might say to his field hands. "There's a whole barrel of perfectly adequate ciderkin for your afternoon refreshment. Keeps you hydrated without making you too wobbly to wield a scythe." Cider was consumed at all times of day, by almost everyone. It was served at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Laborers in the fields would take jugs of cider with them to quench their thirst and provide energy. Travelers would expect to find cider at every tavern. It was used in cooking, for making vinegar, and even sometimes as a medium of payment for goods or services. The cider barrel in the cellar was as essential a part of the colonial household as the fireplace or the flour bin. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some colonial cider makers would occasionally add unusual ingredients to their barrels during fermentation, ostensibly to enhance the flavor, increase the alcoholic strength, or improve the cider's keeping qualities. These might include raisins for extra sugar and body, molasses, various spices, or even, according to some old accounts, pieces of meat like beef or pork, or even a whole chicken. The idea was that the meat would somehow feed the fermentation or add a certain je ne sais quoi. The results must have been interesting, to say the least. This cider has a lovely hint of bacon, a surprised tavern patron might remark. In the taverns, cider would have been a staple, usually the cheapest and most readily available alcoholic drink on offer. The tavern keeper might have several barrels on tap, perhaps of different strengths or ages. It would be served in pewter tankards, wooden mugs, or simple earthenware cups. It was the drink of conviviality, the fuel for countless conversations, arguments, songs, and political debates that echoed through those smoky colonial taprooms. The precise average alcoholic content of typical colonial American hard cider, and how consistently it was achieved or maintained, given the reliance on wild fermentation. Varying apple varieties and local cider-making practices is difficult to determine with certainty and likely fluctuated significantly from batch to batch and region to region. It wasn't an exact science, but an art and a tradition passed down through families. So, as you settle back, imagine the crisp autumn air of a colonial orchard, the rhythmic creak of a cider press, and the satisfying gurgle of fresh juice filling a barrel. The apple, in its fermented form, was truly king in colonial America, a symbol of self-sufficiency, a source of daily comfort, and the unassuming, ever-present beverage that lubricated the gears of colonial life. Its reign was long and widespread, only beginning to fade in the 19th century with the rise of beer brewing by German immigrants and the ominous shadow of the temperance movement. But for a good long while, cider was the taste of America. While cider reigned as the everyday king of colonial American beverages, especially in apple-rich regions, beer certainly held its own respectable, if sometimes challenging, position in the tankards and on the tables of the early colonists. For many settlers, particularly those hailing from England, the Netherlands, or parts of Germany, beer was more than just a drink. It was a deeply ingrained part of their cultural heritage, a taste of home, and, like cider, often considered a safer and more nutritious alternative to questionable water. However, brewing consistent, high-quality beer in the New World presented a unique set of hurdles, leading to a fascinating array of colonial brews, from the thin but hydrating small beer to more robust ales flavored with uniquely American ingredients. Let's gently wade into the foamy, often unpredictable world of colonial American brewing. The desire for beer was strong among the early colonists. The passengers on the Mayflower, famously, were concerned about their beer supplies running low, a factor in their decision to land at Plymouth. Early American colonists brought their brewing traditions with them from Europe and attempted to replicate familiar beer styles, but they often had to adapt their recipes and techniques to the available ingredients and conditions of the New World, leading to unique colonial brews. This adaptation was key. One of the first challenges was sourcing the traditional ingredients. Barley, the preferred grain for English-style ales, didn't always thrive as readily in some parts of colonial America as it did in the milder, more consistent climate of Britain. While it was grown, yields could be unpredictable, and it had to compete with other essential crops like maize corn, hops, the bittering and preserving agent that gives many beers their characteristic aroma and flavor, were also initially scarce. They had to be imported at considerable expense, or colonists had to experiment with cultivating European hop varieties in American soil, which took time and often met with mixed success. This led to a great deal of improvisation. When barley was in short supply or too expensive, colonial brewers turned to other grains. Maize, a New World crop, was abundant and could be malted, though with different results than barley. Oats, rye, and even wheat were sometimes used in the grist, lending different flavors and textures to the resulting brew. To compensate for the lack of hops, or to stretch their precious supply, brewers experimented with native bittering agents and flavorings. They might use the resinous tips of spruce or fir trees, the bark of certain trees like sassafras or birch, various herbs and spices, some native, some imported, or even things like dried pumpkin, persimmons, or molasses to add flavor, color, and fermentable sugars. This led to a wide range of uniquely American beer styles, born out of necessity and ingenuity. Imagine a colonial brewer, scratching his head, looking at his dwindling supply of English hops, and then at the vast, unfamiliar forest. Right then, lads, who wants to try my new acorn and sumac special bitter? It's got a certain rustic charm, and it'll probably keep the squirrels away. Perhaps the most common and important type of beer in colonial households was small beer. This was a very weak, low-alcohol brew, typically with an alcohol content of around 1% or even less, making it comparable to some modern near beers or table beers. It was usually made from the second runnings of the mash. After the strong wort, the sugary liquid extracted from the malted grains was drawn off for making stronger ale. Hot water would be passed through the spent grains again to extract any remaining sugars. This weaker wort would then be fermented to produce small beer. It wasn't intended for intoxication. It was the everyday hydrating beverage for the entire family, including children and servants. It was considered safer than water, provided some calories and nutrients, and was cheap to produce. Every well-managed household aimed to have a constant supply of small beer on hand. It was the colonial equivalent of having a water cooler, but with a bit more flavor and a lot less cali. For those seeking something with a bit more character and alcoholic kick, there were stronger ales, porters, and stouts. These would be brewed with a higher concentration of malt, aiming to emulate the popular styles from England. Taverns would certainly offer these more potent brews, and wealthier households might brew their own for special occasions or for the master of the house. Achieving consistency and quality with these stronger beers, however, was a constant challenge. Given the variability of ingredients, wild yeast contamination, and lack of precise temperature control during brewing and fermentation, a batch of strong ale could turn out wonderfully robust and flavorful, or it could end up sour. Smoky if the malt was poorly kilned, or just plain weird. One particularly notable colonial brew was spruce beer. This was often made by boiling the fresh green tips of spruce or fir trees, which are rich in vitamin C, along with molasses or other sugars for fermentation. Its popularity stemmed not just from its unique, resinous, piney flavor and acquired taste for some, no doubt, but also from its well-recognized anti-scorbutic properties. It helped to prevent scurvy, a common and debilitating disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, especially on long sea voyages or during winters when fresh fruits and vegetables were scarce. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Benjamin Franklin, that quintessential American polymath, famously published a recipe for spruce beer in his Poor Richard's Almanac, lauding its health benefits and pleasant taste. He recommended it as a wholesome and refreshing drink. If Ben Franklin endorsed it, it must have had something going for it, even if it did taste a bit like drinking a Christmas tree. Other locally inspired brews included pumpkin ale using pumpkin in the mash for fermentable sugars and flavor, especially around harvest time. Molasses beer relying heavily on molasses, a cheap and abundant source of sugar from the rum trade. For fermentation, and even persimmon beer in southern regions where persimmons were plentiful, these reflect the colonists' pragmatic approach: use what you have, and try to make it drinkable, or at least safer than the local pond water. The role of women in brewing was significant, especially in the early colonial period. Brewing beer for household consumption was often considered a domestic chore, part of a woman's responsibility as the alewife or brewster of the home. Many women possessed considerable brewing skills passed down through generations. As towns grew and demand increased, commercial breweries began to emerge, often run by men. But the tradition of home brewing by women continued for a long time, particularly in rural areas. The taste of colonial beer would likely be quite different from most modern craft or commercial beers. Without consistent hopping rates, precise temperature control, or pure yeast cultures, flavors could vary wildly. They were often uncarbonated or only very lightly effervescent, served directly from the cask, likely cloudy or hazy with yeast and proteins, and could possess a range of flavors from sweet and malty to tart. Sour, smoky if the malt was dried over an open wood fire, or strongly flavored by the various adjuncts like spruce, pumpkin, or molasses. It was a more rustic, less refined product, but it was their beer, a taste of home, a source of comfort, and a vital part of their daily sustenance. The degree to which colonial American brewers consciously adapted existing English brewing recipes and methodologies to New World ingredients and conditions, versus developing distinctly American styles from the very outset, is a complex question involving ingredient availability, the transfer of brewing knowledge, brewer skill, and evolving consumer preferences throughout the colonial period. It was likely a bit of both, a blend of tradition and innovation, necessity and experimentation. And every so often, a batch probably went so spectacularly wrong it could only be used to clean the pewter mugs, or perhaps as a particularly potent form of bear repellent. We've sampled the ubiquitous ciders and the often experimental beers that flowed through colonial American taverns and households. These beverages, born of orchard fruit and hardy grains, were staples, providing hydration, nutrition, and a gentle alcoholic warmth. But as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, another, more potent spirit began its ascent, quickly capturing the colonial palate and transforming the social and economic landscape of the Americas. Rum. This fiery liquor, distilled from the byproducts of Caribbean sugar plantations, became so popular, so deeply ingrained in colonial life, that some historians have even dubbed the 18th century the rum century in America. Let's gently uncork this potent part of colonial history and explore how rum's sweet, smoky embrace came to dominate the taverns and trade routes of the New World. The story of rum in colonial America is inextricably linked with the sugar islands of the Caribbean, places like Barbados, Jamaica, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti. These islands, with their tropical climates, were ideally suited for growing sugarcane, a crop that produced immense wealth for European colonial powers through the brutal exploitation of enslaved African labor. The process of refining sugarcane into crystallized sugar left behind a thick, dark, sticky byproduct molasses. For a time, molasses was often considered mere industrial waste, sometimes even dumped into the sea. But enterprising individuals soon discovered that this sugar-rich syrup could be fermented and then distilled to produce a powerful alcoholic spirit rum. Rum, produced from molasses imported from the West Indies, became an extremely popular and economically significant alcoholic beverage in colonial America. Playing a key role in the transatlantic trade networks of the 17th and 18th centuries, this Caribbean rum, in its various forms, began to make its way north to the American colonies. There were different styles. Some islands produced lighter, clearer rums often associated with Spanish traditions, while others, particularly the English and French islands like Jamaica and Barbados, became famous for darker, heavier, more pungent and flavorful rums, often aged in oak casks. These imported rums, while highly desirable, could also be relatively expensive. This created an opportunity for colonial American ingenuity, or perhaps thriftiness. Enterprising merchants and distillers in New England, port cities like Boston, Massachusetts, Newport, Rhode Island, and Medford, Massachusetts, realized that they could import cheap molasses directly from the Caribbean in vast quantities, and then distill their own rum locally. This New England rum quickly became a major industry. It was generally a rougher, less refined, and often younger, less aged product than the finer Caribbean rums, but it was significantly cheaper and more readily available to the average colonist. It was potent, it was affordable, and it packed a punch. The smell of molasses and distilling rum would have been a familiar aroma in the bustling dockside areas of these colonial cities. You can imagine a tavern keeper in Boston proudly announcing, "Just tapped a fresh cask of Medford's finest, guaranteed to warm your cockles, or possibly dissolve your pewter mug if you leave it in too long." Your choice? Rum's popularity soared for several reasons. Its potency was certainly a factor. Compared to the often mild ciders and small beers, rum offered a much quicker and more noticeable alcoholic effect. In a hardworking, often harsh colonial society, a tot of rum could provide a welcome warmth, a temporary escape, or a boost of Dutch courage. It was also relatively cheap, especially the domestically produced New England varieties, making it accessible to a broad spectrum of the population. Its versatility was another advantage. It could be drunk neat, though this was often a recipe for a swift and brutal intoxication. Diluted with water, the basis of grog for sailors, or importantly for tavern life. Used as the foundational spirit in a wide array of mixed drinks like punches, toddies, and slings, which we'll explore in more detail later. Rum also traveled well. Being a distilled spirit, it was stable and less prone to spoilage during long sea voyages compared to beer or wine, making it an ideal trade commodity. This brings us to rum's darker side, its central role in the triangle trade. This infamous trade network involved ships sailing from New England ports, carrying rum and other goods to the coast of West Africa. There, the rum would be traded for enslaved Africans. These horrifically mistreated human beings were then transported across the Atlantic in the brutal conditions of the Middle Passage to the Caribbean sugar islands, where they were sold to work on the sugar plantations. The ships would then load up with molasses produced by enslaved labor and return to New England, where the molasses would be distilled into more rum, and the cycle would continue. It was a deeply exploitative and morally reprehensible system, but one that generated immense profits for merchants and distillers in New England and fueled the demand for both sugar and rum. While we're here to explore forgotten beverages in a sleepy way, it's crucial to acknowledge the profound human cost embedded in the history of this particular spirit. The social impact of rum in colonial America was immense. It became the go-to spirit in most taverns, far outpacing brandy or whiskey, which became more prominent later, especially on the frontier. Sailors in the Royal Navy and on merchant ships were often given a daily ration of rum, usually diluted with water to create grog, a practice intended to make the rum last longer and to keep the sailors somewhat functional, though not always successfully. Rum was a feature at almost every social gathering, from barn raisings and weddings to funerals and election days where candidates often plied voters with free rum to win their support, a practice known as swilling the planters with bumbo, cane. George Washington himself was known to distribute rum punch to voters when he ran for the Virginia House of Burgesses. A vote for Washington is a vote for, well, at least another cup of this rather excellent rum punch, a colonial voter might declare. However, the ubiquity and potency of rum also led to widespread problems with drunkenness and alcohol abuse. Colonial records are full of accounts of public intoxication, brawls, and accidents fueled by excessive rum consumption. Ministers and social reformers began to decry rum as a demon drink, a source of moral decay and social disorder, laying some of the early groundwork for the temperance movements that would gain force in the 19th century. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some of the particularly harsh, unrefined, and potent rums distilled in New England or traded in less reputable circles earned evocative nicknames like Kill Devil, Hell Broth, or Whistlebelly Vengeance, names that speak volumes about their fiery character and their less-than-genteel effects on the consumer. You probably wouldn't find Whistlebelly Vengeance on the artisanal cocktail menu at a modern speakeasy. Historians continue to analyze the precise economic impact of the rum trade on the development of New England port cities and the broader colonial economy, weighing its undeniable profitability and role in capital accumulation against its profound social and ethical costs, particularly its deep entanglement with the transatlantic slave trade and the exploitation of enslaved labor in the Caribbean. It's a complex legacy, one that can't be separated from the simple act of ordering a tot of rum in a colonial tavern. So, as you imagine yourself in that bustling colonial taproom, the air thick with pipe smoke and conversation, the chances are high that many of the pewter mugs being slammed down on the rough wooden tables would contain rum, fiery, sweet, and potent. It was the spirit that fueled much of colonial America, for better and for worse. A liquid legacy of the Sugar Islands, a testament to colonial enterprise, and a dark reminder of the human cost of its production and trade. Its story is as intoxicating and as complicated as the drink itself. We've quaffed the ubiquitous ciders, sampled the often surprising colonial beers, and felt the fiery embrace of Caribbean and New England rum. These were the workhorses of the colonial beverage world, found in farmhouses and taverns from the bustling ports of Boston to the quieter settlements of Virginia. But for the colonial elite, the wealthy merchants, the landed gentry, the royal governors, and those with aspirations to European sophistication, there was another category of drink that spoke of status, refinement, and a connection to the old world wine. While America would eventually become a major wine-producing nation, in the colonial period, a truly fine glass of wine was most often an imported luxury, a taste of distant vineyards, supplemented by the often challenging, sometimes comical, and occasionally promising attempts to cultivate local vines. So, let's gently swirl our imaginary glasses and explore the claret dreams and fledgling domestic vintages of colonial America. For the average colonist toiling on their farm or in their workshop, wine was likely a rare treat. If experienced at all, it was significantly more expensive than cider, beer, or even rum. But in the grander homes of Philadelphia, Charleston, or Williamsburg, and in the taverns that catered to a more affluent clientele, imported wine was a staple of genteel hospitality and a marker of social standing. Madeira was one of the most popular and remarkably resilient imported wines in colonial America, prized for its ability to withstand the rigors of long, hot sea voyages and, fascinatingly, even improve with the heat and agitation encountered on such journeys. This made it uniquely suited for the transatlantic trade, unlike more delicate European wines that could easily spoil en route. Madeira, a fortified wine from the Portuguese island of the same name, seemed to thrive on adversity. It was shipped in casks, and the rocking of the ship, the heat of the tropics if the voyage passed through them, all contributed to its aging process, giving it a distinctive nutty, caramelized flavor. Wealthy colonists would often age their Madeira further in their own cellars, or even by sending casks on a round-trip sea voyage just for the maturation. Imagine ordering your wine with extra sea miles for better flavor, a truly colonial concept. This Madeira has an excellent bouquet of the mid-Atlantic, with just a hint of that storm off the Azores. Perfection. Beyond Madeira, other imported wines grace the tables of the colonial elite. Port, another fortified wine from Portugal, was popular, as was sherry or sack, as it was often called from Spain. From France came claret, the red wines of Bordeaux, highly esteemed but also more delicate and prone to spoilage during transport, making them even more of a luxury. German Rhine wines, often called Hock, and sweet wines from the Canary Islands also found their way into colonial cellars. These wines would arrive in casks and then be carefully decanted into glass bottles, another status symbol for serving. Often after a period of settling in the cellar to allow any sediment to fall. The process of managing a wine cellar, ensuring proper storage, and knowing when a wine was ready to drink was a mark of a sophisticated household. The tavern keeper in a high-end establishment would also need this knowledge to satisfy his discerning patrons. Goodman Davies. A wealthy merchant might instruct his tavern keeper, lay down that new cask of Canary for 6 months, but the Bristol milk sherry should be ready for tapping by next Tuesday's meeting of the Philosophical Society, and ensure the claret isn't too colonial. While imported wines were the gold standard for quality and prestige, there was also a persistent dream among the colonists of creating a thriving local wine industry, one that could rival those of Europe and contribute to the economic self-sufficiency of the colonies. After all, North America was abundant in native grapevines. However, these early attempts at American viticulture were fraught with challenges. The Native American grape varieties, such as the Scuppernong in the south, the Catawba, or the Vitis labrusca fox grape common in the north, were genetically very different from the European Vitis vinifera vines that produce the classic wines of France, Spain, and Italy. Wines made from these native grapes often had a distinct, unfamiliar flavor profile, sometimes described as foxy, a musky, earthy aroma and taste, which wasn't always appreciated by palates accustomed to European wines. Moreover, these native grapes often had different sugar and acid balances, requiring different winemaking techniques. Undeterred, many colonists tried to cultivate imported European Vitis vinifera cuttings. Figures like Lord de la Warr in Virginia in the early 17th century, and later William Penn in Pennsylvania, made concerted efforts to establish vineyards with European vines. However, these attempts almost invariably met with failure or very limited success. The European vines, unaccustomed to the New World's climate, soils, and, crucially, its native pests and diseases, often succumbed. The exact impact of specific Native American grape diseases and pests like the infamous phylloxera root louse, which would devastate European vineyards in the 19th century when accidentally imported there, on the failure of these early European Vitis vinifera plantings in the eastern colonies, versus factors like general climate unsuitability or a lack of sophisticated viticultural knowledge among early settlers, is a complex issue that viticultural historians continue to examine. whatever the precise combination of causes. The dream of producing fine American wines from European grapes remained largely elusive throughout the colonial period. This didn't stop colonists from making wine from whatever grapes they could grow or gather, or even from other fruits entirely. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that many colonial wine recipes, often found in household account books or early almanacs, involve fermenting a wide array of locally available fruits and even vegetables when grapes were scarce or the results disappointing. You might find recipes for parsnip wine, currant wine, elderberry wine, cherry wine, dandelion wine, and even, somewhat alarmingly, tomato wine. This speaks to the colonial spirit of ingenuity and a persistent desire for fermented beverages, even if the results bore little resemblance to a fine Bordeaux. One can only imagine the tasting notes for some of these creations. This vintage of turnip claret has a certain rooty assertiveness with a surprisingly earthy finish. Best served very, very cold, or perhaps not at all. The local wines that were produced, whether from native grapes or these other inventive bases, were likely quite rustic, highly variable in quality from year to year and from maker to maker, and perhaps often sweetened with honey or sugar or fortified with a bit of brandy or rum, to make them more palatable or to help preserve them. They were the everyday table wine for those who couldn't afford imports, or a source of local pride if a particular farmer managed to produce a decent batch. Taverns might offer some of these local vintages, probably at a much lower price than the imported Madeiras and clarets. So, the world of wine in colonial America was one of stark contrasts: the aspirational sipping of expensive, imported European vintages by the wealthy elite, and the often frustrating, sometimes surprisingly inventive, attempts to create a homegrown wine culture from the challenging terroir of the New World. It was a story of claret dreams often meeting a reality that tasted more like, well, slightly alcoholic grape juice with an attitude. But the effort continued, laying the groundwork for the much more successful American wine industries that would eventually flourish centuries later. For now, in our colonial tavern, perhaps we'll stick to the Madeira if our imaginary colonial purse allows. Having considered the individual tankards of cider, beer, rum, and the occasional aspirational glass of wine that characterized colonial American drinking, let's now turn our attention to a more communal, more theatrical, and often more potent form of colonial imbibing, the punch bowl. In the 17th and 18th centuries, punch was not just a drink, it was an event, a social ritual, a centerpiece of hospitality and conviviality in taverns, private homes, clubs, and at almost any significant gathering. The sharing of a large, fragrant bowl of carefully concocted punch was a way to foster camaraderie, lubricate conversation, celebrate milestones, and even conduct political business. So, gather round our imaginary colonial punch bowl, and let's dip our ladles into this forgotten art of shared cheer. The very word punch is a little mysterious. The precise origins and etymology of the word punch as applied to this mixed beverage, and the degree to which its supposed 5-ingredient rule from a Hindi word paunch, meaning 5, was consistently followed in early recipes, are still matters of some linguistic and culinary historical discussion. While the 5 ingredients theory, typically spirit, water, sugar, citrus, and spice, is popular, many early punch recipes varied considerably. What is certain is that the concept of a large, shared bowl of a mixed alcoholic drink, often with exotic ingredients, emerged in the 17th century, likely through English sailors and merchants encountering similar concoctions in India or other parts of Asia, and then bringing the idea and the ingredients back to Europe and its colonies. Punch rapidly became an immensely popular communal beverage in 17th and 18th century England and its American colonies, often served in ornate, specially designed bowls at all manner of social gatherings, from rowdy tavern parties to elegant private soirees. What went into a colonial American punch? The recipes were numerous and adaptable, depending on available ingredients, the season, the occasion, and the host's generosity or creativity. However, some core components were common. The spirit base was crucial. In colonial America, rum quickly became the king of punch, especially the robust, flavorful rums from the Caribbean or the potent New England distillations. Its sweetness and strength made it an ideal foundation. However, brandy often imported from France or Spain, an exotic and potent spirit distilled in Asia from rice or palm sap, sometimes imported by East India Company traders, or even sometimes strong wine or cider could be used as the alcoholic backbone, or in combination. A truly lavish punch might feature several different spirits. Our host, Governor Wentworth, is serving his famous artillery punch tonight. A guest might whisper, "I hear it contains 3 types of rum, a splash of brandy, and enough firepower to launch a small frigate." Proceed with caution. Next came the sweetener. Refined loaf sugar, imported from the Caribbean sugar plantations, was the preferred choice for finer punches. This sugar came in hard, conical loaves, and chunks would be broken off with special sugar nippers, then muddled or dissolved in a little water or spirit. Molasses, a cheaper and more readily available byproduct of sugar refining, could also be used, especially in more rustic punches, lending a darker color and a more robust flavor. Honey or even maple syrup in northern colonies might occasionally find their way into the mix. Citrus was essential for providing a balancing acidity and a bright, fresh aroma. Lemons and limes, imported from the West Indies or Mediterranean regions, were highly prized, though they could be expensive and seasonal. Their juice and often their zest, the fragrant outer peel, were key ingredients. If fresh lemons or limes were unavailable, colonists might resort to verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes, or even a dash of vinegar to provide the necessary tartness, though this would certainly alter the flavor profile. Is that a hint of turnip vinegar in this punch? Bartholomew, how inventive? Water, or sometimes weak tea, was used to dilute the potent mixture, making it more palatable for extended drinking sessions and stretching the more expensive ingredients. The quality of the water mattered, as we've discussed, so sometimes previously boiled water or tea was preferred. Finally, spice added complexity, aroma, and a touch of exotic luxury. Nutmeg was almost ubiquitous in punches, often freshly grated over the top as a garnish. Cinnamon, cloves, and allspice, also known as Jamaica pepper or pimento, were also common, their warm, aromatic notes blending beautifully with the spirit. Sugar and citrus. These spices, largely imported, were valuable commodities, and their generous use in a punch signaled the host's affluence and hospitality. The ritual of making and serving punch was often part of the entertainment. The host, or a designated punch master, might prepare the concoction with great ceremony in front of the guests. The ingredients would be carefully measured and mixed in a large, often beautiful punch bowl. These bowls themselves were status symbols, made of imported Chinese porcelain, English Delftware, polished silver, or even fine glass. A large, ornate punch bowl, brimming with fragrant liquid, was the centerpiece of any significant gathering. The punch would be served using a ladle, often with a long wooden or silver handle and a deep bowl, into individual cups or glasses. Punch was the ultimate social lubricant. Sharing a drink from a common bowl fostered a sense of camaraderie, equality at least for the duration of the drinking, and shared experience. It was the perfect accompaniment to long evenings of conversation, storytelling, singing, card games, or political debate. Business deals were sealed over a bowl of punch. Friendships were forged, and perhaps more than a few revolutionary ideas were first voiced as the ladle made its rounds. Famous colonial institutions like the Schuylkill Fishing Company in Philadelphia, one of America's oldest social clubs, had their own legendary punch recipes. Like the potent Philadelphia Fish House Punch, which, though its specific, highly alcoholic recipe was likely codified a bit later, represents the spirit of these powerful colonial concoctions. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some particularly elaborate colonial punches involved dramatically setting the surface of the punch alight with burning brandy or rum flaming punch for a spectacular visual effect before serving, especially on festive occasions. Others might involve floating toasted bread sops in the bowl, which is one theory for the origin of offering a toast with a drink. Of course, the potency of these punches was legendary and often deceptive. The combination of strong spirits, sweet sugar, and refreshing citrus could make them dangerously easy to drink, and overindulgence was common. Many a colonial diary or letter writer ruefully recounts the morning after effects of a particularly vigorous punch bowl session. The path from convivial camaraderie to collective colonial hangover was often a swift and well-ladled one. So, as you imagine that warm, firelit tavern or elegant colonial drawing room, picture that gleaming punch bowl at its center, a fragrant, inviting beacon drawing people together. It was more than just a mixed drink. It was a shared experience, a symbol of hospitality, a fuel for friendship and debate, and a potent reminder of the interconnected colonial world, with its exotic ingredients drawn from distant shores, all mingling together in one cheerful, intoxicating brew. Just remember to pace yourself if you ever encounter a historically accurate reproduction. Those colonial measures were generous. We've explored the communal cheer of the colonial punch bowl, a beverage often enjoyed at room temperature or perhaps slightly cooled if circumstances allowed. But colonial America, particularly in its northern and mid-Atlantic regions, experienced long, cold winters and chilly evenings even in other seasons. In such weather, the human desire for warmth and comfort naturally extended to what was in their mugs. And so, colonial taverns and homes developed a fascinating array of hot alcoholic concoctions, drinks designed to chase away the chill, soothe the spirits, and provide a welcome internal glow. Let's huddle closer to our imaginary colonial hearth and explore the steaming, spiced, and often surprisingly complex world of flips, toddies, and other hot cockles that warmed the colonial soul. These weren't just drinks, they were liquid fireplaces. Perhaps the most iconic and uniquely colonial hot beverage was the flip. If you walked into a tavern on a blustery winter's night, the chances were high you'd see and smell a flip being prepared. Hot alcoholic beverages like flips, toddies, and mulled drinks were immensely popular in colonial America, particularly during colder weather, offering warmth, sustenance, and a convivial atmosphere. But the flip was in a class of its own, as much for its preparation as for its taste. The basic ingredients of a flip typically included a strong beer, often a dark, malty ale or porter, a generous measure of rum or sometimes brandy or even whiskey as it became more available, and a sweetener like sugar, molasses or maple syrup. Sometimes an egg or just the yolk would be beaten into the mixture, adding richness and a frothy texture. But the real magic, the defining characteristic of a flip, was in how it was heated and frothed. This was achieved by plunging a red-hot iron poker, known as a loggerhead, a flip dog, or simply a hoth, directly into the mug of mixed ingredients. Imagine the scene: the tavern keeper pulls a glowing loggerhead from the embers of the fireplace, its tip almost white-hot. He thrusts it into the waiting mug. There's a dramatic hiss, a cloud of fragrant steam, a furious bubbling and frothing as the intense heat instantly warms the drink, caramelizes some of the sugars, cooks the egg if used, and creates a wonderfully thick, creamy, slightly burnt-tasting foam on top. It was dinner and a show all in one mug. The resulting drink was warm, sweet, strong, and possessed a unique, slightly smoky or singed flavor from the interaction with the hot iron. It was considered deeply comforting and highly restorative. Nothing like a well-made flip to put the warmth back in a man's bones, a frost-covered traveler might declare, cradling his steaming mug. Though I do believe young Timothy the apprentice nearly set his own wig aflame with that loggerhead. The loggerhead itself, that essential tool for flip making, was a standard piece of tavern fireplace equipment, a long iron rod with a bulbous or flattened end that could retain heat well. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that these loggerheads, being sturdy, heavy, and often within easy reach by the fire, could sometimes become impromptu weapons if a tavern dispute escalated into a brawl. This is one of the proposed origins of the English idiom to be at loggerheads, meaning to be in stubborn disagreement or conflict. So, that humble drink-stirring tool also had a more assertive potential. Another popular hot drink, perhaps a bit simpler to prepare than the theatrical flip, was the toddy, or hot toddy. This was and still is a classic winter warmer. The colonial version would typically involve a spirit base. Again, rum or brandy were favorites, with whiskey gaining popularity later, especially on the frontier. To this would be added hot water, a sweetener sugar, molasses, or honey, and often a selection of warming spices like grated nutmeg, cinnamon, or a clove or two. A slice or peel of lemon, if available, might add a welcome tang. The hot toddy was appreciated for its soothing qualities, often taken as a remedy for colds or chills, or simply as a comforting nightcap before retiring to a likely very cold colonial bed. It was less about the froth and drama of the flip, and more about straightforward, uncomplicated warmth and cheer. Closely related to the toddy was the sling. A sling could be served hot or cold, but the hot version was popular in winter. It typically consisted of a spirit, hot water, and sugar, often with a grating of nutmeg on top. Some definitions suggest a sling might also include a citrus element, like a twist of lemon or lime peel, blurring the lines with a toddy. The exact distinction could be a bit hazy and might vary from tavern to tavern or recipe to recipe. The exact regional variations and evolution of recipes for common mixed drinks like flip, sling, or toddy throughout the colonial period are often difficult to trace with absolute precision, as recipes were frequently unwritten, passed down orally, or highly personalized by individual tavern keepers, households, or even personal preference. It was more art than exact science, more about a goodly dash of this and a fair measure of that. For those who preferred a less spirit-forward hot drink, there was mulled wine or mulled cider. Mulling simply means to heat a beverage, usually wine or cider, with sugar and spices. This was a common practice in Europe and was readily adopted in the colonies. A robust red wine, perhaps an imported claret, or a domestic attempt, or a good, strong hard cider would be gently heated in a pot over the fire with sugar or molasses to sweeten it, and a fragrant mix of spices like cinnamon sticks, whole cloves, allspice berries, and freshly grated nutmeg. Sometimes a slice of orange or lemon might be added. The resulting drink was aromatic, warming, and pleasantly sweet and spicy, perfect for festive occasions or just a cozy evening by the fire. It made the whole tavern smell like a colonial Christmas, even if it was only November and everyone was just trying to get through another damp Tuesday. And we mustn't forget the early forms of eggnog, though it became more elaborate and more strongly associated with winter holidays in the 19th century. Colonial versions existed, typically involving milk or cream, beaten eggs, sugar, a generous lacing of spirit rum, brandy, or sometimes fortified wine like sherry or Madeira, and a dusting of nutmeg or other spices. Served warm, it was a rich, nourishing, and highly potent concoction. Definitely a special occasion drink rather than an everyday tipple. Given the cost of ingredients like cream, eggs, sugar, and good spirits all in one go, it was like a boozy liquid custard designed to fortify one against the harshest winter weather, or perhaps just against a particularly dull sermon. These hot, spiced, and spirited beverages were a vital part of colonial tavern culture, especially during the long, cold months. They offered more than just alcoholic refreshment. They provided physical warmth, a sense of comfort and well-being, a sociable way to share cheer, and sometimes a perceived medicinal benefit. The sensory experience alone, the fragrant steam rising from a mug of mulled cider, the sight of a loggerhead plunging into a flip, the rich aroma of nutmeg and rum in a hot toddy was an integral part of their appeal, a small but significant pleasure in a world that often offered few creature comforts. So, as the colonial night draws in and the fire roars, you can almost taste that sweet, spicy, warming glow spreading through you from one of these forgotten hot cockles. We've warmed ourselves with the steaming, spirited concoctions like flips and toddies that colonial taverns offered to ward off the winter chill. But not every colonial thirst was for something hot and alcoholic, especially during the sweltering summer months or for laborers toiling in the fields under a hot sun. There was a pressing need for refreshing, thirst-quenching beverages that could hydrate and revitalize without necessarily intoxicating. And while safe water was often a concern, the colonists, with their characteristic ingenuity, developed a range of tangy, and often vinegar-based, non-alcoholic, or only very mildly alcoholic refreshers. Let's explore the world of switchels and shrubs, the haymaker's helpers, and tart thirst quenchers that provided a different kind of colonial cool. These are truly forgotten beverages for many, though they are seeing a fascinating craft revival today. First, let's meet the Switchel, sometimes picturesquely known as Haymaker's Punch. Switchel, a non-alcoholic or sometimes very mildly alcoholic beverage, typically made with water, vinegar, often cider vinegar, and a sweetener like molasses, honey, maple syrup, or brown sugar, sometimes with ginger or other spices added, was a traditional and highly effective thirst-quenching drink for farmers and laborers in colonial America, especially during strenuous summer work like haying season. Imagine yourself out in a colonial field in the heat of July or August, the sun beating down, the air thick and humid, engaged in the back-breaking labor of cutting, raking, and stacking hay. Plain water, even if available and safe, might not feel like it truly cuts your thirst or replenishes your energy. Switchel was designed to do just that. The key ingredients were simple and usually readily available. Water, of course, formed the base. To this was added vinegar, most commonly apple cider vinegar, which was a byproduct of all that cider making we discussed earlier. The acidity of the vinegar was believed to be more effective at quenching thirst than plain water, and it also had a pleasant tartness. Then came the sweetener. Molasses, being cheap and plentiful due to the rum trade, was a very common choice, lending a dark color and a robust, slightly bittersweet flavor. Honey, if available, or maple syrup in northern colonies where maple trees abounded, could also be used, providing different nuances of sweetness. Some recipes also called for a bit of ginger, either fresh grated if you could get it, or powdered. Ginger not only added a pleasant, spicy kick, but was also thought to soothe the stomach and aid digestion, which could be helpful after a heavy midday meal before returning to hard labor. The mixture would be prepared, often in a large jug or cask, and taken out to the fields, where it would be served cool, perhaps kept in a shaded spot or a damp, cloth-wrapped container to benefit from evaporative cooling to the thirsty workers. It provided hydration, a bit of energy from the sweetener, and that tart, refreshing quality that cut through the dust and heat. It wasn't a sophisticated cocktail, it was a functional, life-sustaining field drink. The colonial equivalent of a sports drink, but without the artificial colors and electrolytes you can't pronounce. Another long road-a-hoe, lads, the farmer might say, wiping his brow. But there's a fresh jug of Switchel waiting under the old oak tree. That'll put the lead back in your colonial pencils. The name Switchel itself has somewhat obscure origins, a quirky or fringe tidbit being that some linguistic theories link it to Old English dialect words like swizzle to stir a drink or other now-lost drink-related terms. But its exact etymology remains uncertain. It was also sometimes known more descriptively as ginger water or simply harvest drink. Then there was the shrub, a beverage with a similar tart, refreshing profile, but often with a more pronounced fruit element and a slightly more genteel reputation, though it also had rustic versions. There were generally two main types of shrubs in the colonial period, though the lines could blur. The one most relevant to our discussion of thirst quenchers was the vinegar-based shrub. This was typically made by preserving fruit, often berries like raspberries, blackberries or currants, but also peaches, cherries, or even rhubarb, in vinegar and sugar. The fruit would steep in the vinegar and sugar mixture for several days or weeks, creating a concentrated, intensely flavored, sweet tart syrup. This syrup, once strained of the fruit solids, was the shrub. To serve it as a beverage, a small amount of this potent shrub syrup would be mixed with plain water still, or much later. Sparkling water, soda water, when that became available, or sometimes even with a spirit like rum or brandy to create an alcoholic shrub cocktail, the acidity of the vinegar, balanced by the sweetness of the sugar and the flavor of the fruit, made for an incredibly refreshing and sophisticated drink, perfect for sipping on a hot afternoon. It was a way to preserve the fleeting flavors of summer fruits long into the year, and the vinegar itself was thought to have cooling and health-giving properties. The other type of shrub, the spirit-based shrub, was more of a liqueur, made by steeping fruit, often citrus peel, like lemons or oranges, and sugar directly in a spirit like rum or brandy. This would then be strained and aged, resulting in a sweet, potent, fruit-infused spirit that could be sipped on its own or used as a component in other mixed drinks. While delicious, this is less about everyday thirst quenching and more about an after-dinner tipple. Our focus for forgotten beverages that served a broader purpose leans towards the vinegar-based shrub as a refreshing mixer. Both switchels and vinegar-based shrubs represent a fascinating category of colonial drinks that relied on the preservative and flavor-enhancing qualities of vinegar. In an era before widespread refrigeration, vinegar was a household staple, used not just for pickling and preserving food, but also for creating these unique and invigorating beverages. They offered a welcome alternative to plain water or the heavier alcoholic drinks, providing a tart, tangy, and often fruity refreshment that could cut through the heat and humidity. Some taverns might have offered a basic switchel or a house-made shrub syrup to mix with water or spirits, though these were also very commonly homemade beverages, with each family perhaps having their own preferred recipe or secret ingredient. Martha's raspberry shrub is the talk of the county. A colonist might remark, though I hear old Goody Perkins still insists on making hers with turnips. An acquired taste, and to be sure. The precise balance of ingredients and the specific regional recipe variations for colonial-era switchels and vinegar-based shrubs, and the extent of their commercial availability in taverns versus their purely domestic production, are areas where detailed historical records are often sparse. Recipes were often passed down orally or jotted in household account books, rather than being formally published. But their widespread mention in diaries, letters, and agricultural almanacs attest to their common use and appreciation as practical, refreshing, and uniquely colonial beverages. They are a wonderful example of making the most of what you had, turning simple ingredients like vinegar, water, and sweetener into something that could make a hard day's labor just a little more bearable. And unlike some of the more potent concoctions, you could drink a fair bit of switchel and still manage to wield your scythe in a relatively straight line. Usually, we've explored the robust ciders, the experimental beers, the fiery rums, the aspirational wines, the communal punches, the warming flips, and the tangy switchels and shrubs that once flowed in colonial American taverns and homes. But there's another category of beverage, one that often blurred the lines between drink, dessert, and even medicinal remedy. That deserves our sleepy attention. Rich, creamy, dairy-based concoctions like possets and syllabubs. In a time when fresh milk could be a precious and perishable commodity, these drinks transformed it, often with the help of spices, sugar, and a generous splash of alcohol, into comforting, nourishing, and sometimes surprisingly sophisticated treats. Let's gently ladle ourselves a serving of these creamy colonial comforts. First, let us consider the posset. This was a hot, milky beverage, often enjoyed in the evening, particularly in colder weather, or given to those who were unwell or in need of comfort and nourishment. Possets and syllabubs were popular dairy-based beverages or light desserts in England and colonial America from roughly the 16th to the 19th centuries, valued for their richness, their perceived restorative qualities, and their comforting warmth in the case of possets. The fundamental characteristic of a posset was that it involved hot milk, curdled with an acidic alcoholic beverage. Typically, sack a type of sherry, another strong wine, or sometimes ale. Imagine the preparation. Milk would be heated, often with sugar or honey to sweeten it, and a fragrant mix of spices. Nutmeg was almost essential, along with cinnamon, cloves, or mace. Once the spiced milk was hot, the wine or ale would be stirred in. The alcohol and acidity would cause the milk to curdle, separating into a thicker, custard-like part the curds and a thinner, watery liquid the whey. This might sound a bit unappetizing to modern palates accustomed to perfectly smooth dairy drinks, but for the colonial consumer, this separation was part of its unique character. The posset would be served warm, often in a special posset pot. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that these posset pots, examples of which survive in ceramic collections, often had two handles and a long spout emerging from near the bottom of the pot. This allowed the drinker to sip the clearer, thinner whey from below, while the richer, thicker curds remained on top. To be eaten later with a spoon? It was a two-course beverage, in a way. Ah, a fine posset, mistress, a colonial gentleman might say, recovering from a chill. I shall sip the restorative whey now, and save the delightful curds for when my strength truly returns. Or perhaps just for 5 minutes from now. It smells too good to wait. Possets were considered highly nourishing and easily digestible, making them a popular choice for invalids. For women recovering from childbirth, or for anyone feeling a bit under the weather, the warm milk, the spices, the sweetener, and the alcohol were all thought to have restorative or soporific qualities. It was the colonial equivalent of a warm, milky drink before bed, but with a significant boozy kick and a bit more culinary complexity. Then there was the Syllabub, a rather more elegant and often more dessert-like creation. While possets were usually hot and curdled, Syllabubs were generally served cool or at room temperature and were prized for their light, frothy, creamy texture. There were many variations, but the basic ingredients typically involved wine, often a sweet white wine like sack or Rhenish wine, cider, or sometimes ale, mixed with fresh cream or rich milk, sugar, and flavorings such as lemon zest or juice, and, of course, spices like nutmeg. The magic of the syllabub often lay in its preparation, designed to create that signature froth. One method involved whisking the cream and wine mixture vigorously to create a light, airy foam. Another, more picturesque method, particularly for what was known as everlasting syllabub, involved milking a cow directly into a bowl already containing the sweetened and spiced wine or cider. The warm, fresh milk, hitting the other ingredients from a height, would naturally create a beautiful, stable froth. The mixture would then be left to stand for several hours or even overnight in a cool place. During this time, it would separate into a clear liquid layer at the bottom and a thicker, clotted, foamy cream on top, which could be spooned off and served. It was a delicate, luxurious treat, often presented in special syllabub glasses, and considered a fine ending to an elegant meal or a delightful refreshment at a summer gathering. It was less about robust warmth and more about refined, creamy pleasure. Do try Mrs. Washington's syllabub. A guest at Mount Vernon might be urged. It's as light as a cloud and tastes like angels have been milking cows directly into a bowl of spiced sherry, which, I believe, is precisely how she makes it. A simpler, more everyday dairy-based drink that often contained alcohol was milk punch. This could be served hot or cold. The basic recipe involved milk. A spirit rum and brandy were favorites, sugar, and a grating of nutmeg. Unlike a posset, it wasn't typically curdled. A cold milk punch. Perhaps with the addition of citrus juice and then clarified by straining through the milk curds that form a more complex process leading to English milk punch or clarified milk punch, could be a surprisingly smooth and sophisticated beverage. A hot milk punch was simply a warming, sweetened, spirited milky drink, less fussy than a posset. These dairy-based beverages showcase the colonial ability to transform a simple, perishable ingredient like milk into something more luxurious, more comforting, or more festive. They often required access to relatively expensive ingredients like sugar, spices, and good quality wine or spirits, in addition to fresh cream or milk, placing them more in the realm of special occasion treats or the fare of more affluent households and taverns. The social context and perceived medicinal versus purely pleasurable consumption of drinks like possets and syllabubs in colonial America, and how this might have varied by class, gender, and region, is an area of ongoing interest for food historians and social historians. Were they primarily seen as women's drinks or invalid food, or did men also partake freely? The evidence suggests a broad appeal, but with different connotations depending on the specific drink and the setting. For our sleepy journey, imagine the comfort of a warm, spiced posset on a cold night, its fragrant steam rising, its dual textures a gentle surprise, or picture the delicate, frothy crown of a cool syllabub, a light, sweet indulgence at a summer party. These creamy comforts were another forgotten facet of the rich and varied beverage landscape of colonial America, a testament to their ability to create moments of soothing pleasure from the contents of the dairy in the spice box. They might not have had ice cream, but a well-made syllabub could probably give a modern milkshake a run for its money in the creamy delight department. We've explored a fascinating array of colonial beverages, from the everyday ciders and small beers to the more potent rums, aspirational wines, communal punches, warming flips, tangy switchels, and creamy possets. It's clear that drinking in colonial America was a varied and vital part of life. But the line between a simple refreshment, a social lubricant, and a medicinal remedy was often wonderfully, and sometimes rather alarmingly, blurred. In an era long before modern pharmaceuticals, with scientific medical understanding still in its infancy, many of the drinks found in taverns or prepared in households were also believed to possess healing properties, or were specifically concocted as tonics, bitters, and cures for the myriad ailments that afflicted the colonist. So, let's gently lift the lid on the colonial medicine chest, which often looks surprisingly similar to the tavern spirits shelf, and explore these apothecary ales and curative concoctions. The first thing to understand is that in the 17th and 18th centuries, the distinction between food, drink, and medicine was far less rigid than it is today. Many common ailments were treated with dietary adjustments, herbal preparations, and specially formulated beverages. Colonial Americans widely used herbal remedies and medicinal beverages, often prepared at home by the mistress of the house, or by local healers, wise women, or sometimes even the tavern keeper, to treat common illnesses, with many recipes blending traditional European herbalism with newfound knowledge or sometimes misinterpretations of New World plants. The local tavern, being a central hub with a stock of various alcoholic bases and perhaps some common herbs and spices, could often serve as an informal pharmacy. Goodman, a suffering colonist, might say to the innkeeper, "I've a fearsome ague upon me. What have you got that might settle my humors and stop my teeth from chattering like a pair of loose dice in a tankard?" Many of the common alcoholic beverages themselves were often repurposed or enhanced for medicinal use. Ale and beer, for instance, weren't just for quenching thirst. They were sometimes infused with specific bitter or aromatic herbs to create physic ales or diet drinks, not for weight loss, but for a prescribed regimen. Herbs like wormwood, known for its bitterness and as a dewormer, though potent and potentially toxic in large doses, horehound for coughs and lung ailments, dandelion as a diuretic and liver tonic, or chamomile for calming and digestive issues might be steeped in the ale. The alcohol would help to extract the medicinal compounds from the herbs, and the beer itself provided some nourishment. It was a spoonful of medicine, but the spoon was a 2-pint tankard. Wine, especially fortified wines like sack sherry or Madeira, was frequently used as a base for medicinal tinctures. Various herbs, roots, and barks would be steeped in the wine for extended periods, creating a potent liquid remedy. We've already encountered the sack posset, often given to invalids for its perceived strengthening and soothing qualities. Wine was also considered a general restorative, a cordial to lift the spirits and fortify the constitution, particularly for the elderly or those recovering from illness. A small glass of this elderflower-infused sack. Grandmother, a caring daughter might offer. It will put the roses back in your cheeks, or at least make you forget you haven't seen a rose in 6 months due to this infernal winter. Spirits like rum and brandy also played their part in the colonial medicine cabinet. Their high alcohol content made them effective solvents for extracting active compounds from medicinal plants, creating strong tinctures that could be taken in small doses. They were also used externally as antiseptics for wounds, though the understanding of infection was rudimentary. The cleansing effect of alcohol was likely observed. And, of course, a tot of strong rum or brandy was a common remedy for a chill, for shock, or simply to numb pain or anxiety. It was the colonial equivalent of take 2 aspirins and call me in the morning. Except it was more like take 2 fingers of kill devil rum and try not to fall into the fireplace. One particularly interesting category of medicinal tipples was bitters. These were highly concentrated alcoholic infusions of various bitter-tasting herbs, roots, barks, and sometimes spices. Common ingredients might include gentian root, cinchona bark, the source of quinine, which was genuinely effective against malaria, a significant scourge in many colonial regions, especially the South, dandelion root, burdock root, angelica root, orange peel, or various stomachic herbs designed to settle digestive complaints. These ingredients would be steeped in strong alcohol, rum, or brandy were ideal for weeks or months, resulting in a very potent, intensely bitter liquid Bitters were not meant to be drunk in large quantities like beer or wine. Instead, they were taken in small doses, perhaps a teaspoonful or two in a little water or wine, typically before meals to stimulate the appetite and aid digestion, or as a general tonic to purify the blood, tone the system, or ward off fevers and other ailments. Some taverns might have their own proprietary house bitters, a secret concoction that patrons swore by. Others might stock imported bitters, like Stoughton's bitters, which were popular in England and the colonies. The taste was, as the name implies, usually fiercely bitter, a far cry from the sweet, artificially flavored bitters used in many modern cocktails. Taking your colonial bitters was a serious, palate-puckering commitment to health. Another dose of Dr. Throckmorton's celebrated swamp root bitters for me, landlord. Tastes like a badger's armpit, but I haven't had the swamp egg all week. While not strictly tavern fare for public consumption, herbal teas and infusions made with hot water were a ubiquitous part of home-based healthcare and would have informed the kinds of flavors and ingredients colonists expected or sought in their medicinal beverages. Sage tea for sore throats, chamomile for sleeplessness or upset stomachs, mint tea for digestion, raspberry leaf tea for women's ailments. These were common knowledge. Sometimes, these herbal infusions might be fortified with a splash of rum or brandy for an extra kick or a perceived medicinal boost. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some colonial medicinal concoctions contained rather alarming or bizarre ingredients by modern standards, reflecting the era's blend of herbalism, humoral theory, and sheer superstition. You might find recipes calling for powdered animal parts like woodlice or stag's horn, various minerals some of which we now know to be toxic, like mercury or antimony compounds, or even more esoteric ingredients. The famous snake oil remedies of the later American West had their precursors in colonial cure-alls of equally dubious efficacy and sometimes alarming composition. Thankfully, most tavern-based medicinal tipples probably stuck to more conventional, if still potent, herbal infusions in an alcoholic base. The precise extent to which Native American ethnobotanical knowledge directly influenced the formulation of common colonial medicinal beverages and remedies, versus the colonists primarily relying on transplanted European herbal traditions or engaging in their own independent experimentation with New World plants, is a complex and fascinating area of ongoing research for medical historians, anthropologists, and ethnobotanists. There was undoubtedly some exchange of knowledge, but also much that was lost, misunderstood, or independently discovered by the colonists. So, the colonial tavern wasn't just a place for social drinking, it was often an informal health clinic, and the tavern keeper, a de facto pharmacist. The beverages on offer weren't just about quenching thirst or achieving conviviality. Many were imbued with perceived healing powers, a liquid line of defense against the numerous ailments that plagued colonial life. As you drift off, imagine the shelves behind the colonial bar, holding not just casks of cider and rum, but also mysterious bottles of bitters, jars of medicinal herbs, and the secret ingredients for a potent, if perhaps not always palatable, cure for whatever ailed you. We've journeyed through a veritable pantry of colonial American beverages, from the everyday ciders and small beers to the potent rums, luxurious imported wines, communal punches, warming flips, tangy switchels, creamy possets, and even those intriguing apothecary ales and bitters. But who was the figure at the heart of this liquid landscape? The person responsible for sourcing, storing, preparing, and dispensing these myriad concoctions. That, of course, that would be the tavern keeper, also known as the innkeeper, publican, or, in the more deferential language of the time, mine host. This individual, often a respected and influential member of the community, was far more than just a bartender. They were a master of colonial mixology, such as it was, a purveyor of news, a pillar of local society, and sometimes a surprisingly powerful figure. Let's pull up a stool by the bar and get to know this pivotal character in our sleepy story. The first and most fundamental responsibility of the tavern keeper was procurement and management of their beverage inventory. This was no small feat in colonial America. For cider and beer, they might brew their own on the premises if they had the space and equipment, especially in more rural areas. This required skill in malting for beer, brewing, or cider pressing, as well as managing fermentation and storage in barrels, often in a cool cellar. Alternatively, or in addition, they might purchase cider from local farmers or beer from one of the emerging commercial breweries in larger towns. Quality and consistency would vary wildly. A good tavern keeper needed a discerning palate and reliable suppliers to ensure their patrons weren't served something that tasted like last week's dishwater, or worse, something that had turned dangerously sour. Goodman Evans, a traveler might inquire, is your cider from the North Orchard apples this year, or the questionable ones from down by the swamp? My constitution is feeling particular today. For rum, the tavern keeper would deal with local merchants or ship captains who imported molasses from the West Indies for local distillers, or who brought in casks of already distilled Caribbean rum. They'd need to negotiate prices, assess the quality. Rum could vary hugely, from smooth and aged to raw and fiery Kill Devil, and manage their stock. The same went for imported wines like Madeira, port, or claret. These were expensive, high-status goods, and acquiring them involved dealing with specialized wine merchants, understanding vintages to some extent, and having the capital to invest in a decent cellar. Mainstream historical fact, colonial tavern keepers were often significant figures in the local economy, responsible for managing a complex supply chain of both locally produced and imported goods, including alcoholic beverages, foodstuffs, and sometimes even dry goods or stabling for horses. Once the beverages were procured, they needed to be stored and served correctly. Casks of cider, beer, wine, and rum would be kept in the cellar, hopefully cool and dark, to slow spoilage. Tapping a cask properly, ensuring it wasn't broached too soon or left to go stale, was a key skill. Serving drinks at something approaching an appropriate temperature without refrigeration, of course, was also a consideration. A hot flip needed to be genuinely hot. A fine Madeira might be appreciated slightly cooler than the ambient summer heat if it had been resting in the cellar. The tavern keeper was also, in a sense, the original mixologist. As we've seen, many popular colonial drinks were mixed concoctions. They needed to know how to prepare a good punch, balancing the spirit, sugar, citrus, water, and spice. They had to be adept at making a flip, knowing just how hot to get the loggerhead to achieve that perfect, frothy, caramelized character without setting the drink or the patron's eyebrows on fire. They'd mix toddies, slings, and grog, often to a patron's specific preference for strength or sweetness. This wasn't just pouring from a bottle, it was a craft. Their house recipes for these mixed drinks could make or break a tavern's reputation. Aye, the king's head makes a passable rum punch. A discerning patron might opine, but for a truly transcendent flip, you must go to Mistress Higgins at the Crooked Billet. Her loggerhead technique is legendary. Beyond the drinks themselves, the tavern keeper was responsible for overall hospitality and management. This included providing lodging for travelers. Though colonial inn beds were notoriously basic and often shared, a traveler might find themselves sharing a bed not just with one stranger, but with several, and perhaps a few fleas for company. The innkeeper also had to manage the taproom environment, which could be a challenge. While taverns were places of conviviality, they could also be sites of drunkenness, arguments, gambling, and occasional brawls. A good tavern keeper needed a firm but fair hand to maintain a semblance of order, to know when to stop serving a patron who'd had too much, and how to diplomatically or sometimes forcefully deal with unruly behavior. They also often extended credit. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some colonial tavern keepers developed elaborate and very public systems for keeping track of customer debts, sometimes using a large chalkboard or slate where patrons' tabs were visibly recorded, or a system of notches on a tally stick. Cash was often scarce. So much local business was done on credit, and the tavern keeper was effectively a local banker for small sums, hoping their patrons were good for their P's and Q's, pints, and quarts. The tavern keeper was also a vital conduit of news and information. In an era before widespread newspapers or rapid communication, travelers were a primary source of news from other towns, colonies, or even from England. The tavern keeper, by virtue of talking to everyone who passed through it, was often the best informed person in the community. a kind of walking, talking colonial internet router, political discussions, business deals, local gossip. It all flowed through the tavern, and the host was at its center. It's important to note that while mine host was often a man, women played crucial roles in tavern keeping. A tavern keeper's wife was often an indispensable partner, managing the food preparation if offered, the housekeeping for lodgers, perhaps assisting with brewing or serving, and keeping the accounts. Widows frequently took over the running of their deceased husband's tavern, and many proved to be very capable and successful publicans in their own right. These she-merchants, as they were sometimes called, were often formidable figures. Finally, taverns and their keepers were subject to licensing and regulation by local authorities. There were often rules about approved prices for ordinaries, set meals, and basic drinks. Hours of operation, though these were often loosely enforced, prohibitions against serving certain individuals like known drunkards, indentured servants without permission, or sometimes Native Americans, and rules against allowing excessive gambling or disorderly conduct. The tavern keeper had to navigate these regulations while still trying to turn a profit and keep their diverse clientele happy. The degree of social mobility afforded by tavern keeping in colonial America, whether it was generally seen as a reliable path to prosperity and respected community status, or a somewhat precarious and occasionally disreputable profession, likely varied greatly depending on the specific location. A bustling city port versus a remote frontier outpost. The nature of the clientele. The individual acumen and reputation of the proprietor, and the strictness of local social and religious mores. So, as you imagine that colonial tavern keeper, perhaps a stout, aproned man with a ready opinion, or a sharp-witted widow with a keen eye for business, remember that they were far more than just drink pourers. They were curators of colonial beverages, masters of early mixology, providers of shelter, keepers of order, more or less, hubs of information, and central figures in the social, economic, and sometimes even political life of their communities. Their craft was a demanding one, requiring a unique blend of business sense, social skill, and a very good understanding of what made a colonial thirst truly satisfied. We've met the tavern keeper, mine host, the often harried but essential purveyor of colonial America's forgotten beverages. We've explored the vast array of drinks on offer, from the everyday ciders and small beers to the potent rums, sophisticated wines, communal punches, warming flips, and tangy switchels. But simply having these drinks available wasn't the whole story. How were they consumed? What were the social graces, the rituals, the unwritten rules that governed drinking in a colonial tavern, or even in a private home, imbibing in colonial America? Especially in a public setting like a tavern, was often a highly communal and ritualized activity, steeped in customs that reinforced social bonds, celebrated occasions, and sometimes even fueled the fires of revolution. Let's raise our imaginary tankards and explore the world of colonial drinking rituals. One of the most pervasive and important customs was toasting. A formal gathering, a casual meeting of friends, a political debate, or the sealing of a business deal. Almost any occasion could be marked with a toast. Communal drinking, extensive toasting, and the practice of treating buying rounds were important social rituals in colonial American taverns and at private gatherings, serving to reinforce social bonds, celebrate important events, facilitate business transactions, and often to express political allegiances. Toast would be offered to the health of the king or queen at least, before relations with the crown became irrevocably strained, to absent friends, to a successful voyage or harvest, to a newborn child, to the memory of the departed, or, increasingly as the 18th century progressed, to liberty, the rights of Englishmen, or specific political figures and causes. The act of raising a glass in unison, of collectively voicing a sentiment and then drinking to it, was a powerful way to affirm shared values and create a sense of unity. There was often an etiquette to toasting. A certain order might be followed. Specific traditional toasts might be expected on certain occasions, and refusing to join in a widely acclaimed toast could be seen as a social slight or even a political statement. "A toast?" someone would cry. "To the prosperity of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and may our codfish always be plentiful, and our governors slightly less exasperating." And all would raise their mugs in agreement, or at least in polite acquiescence. The very act of drinking was often communal, especially when it came to beverages like punch. As we saw, punch was typically served in a large, shared bowl, from which individuals would ladle servings into their own cups. This act of dipping into a common source fostered a sense of fellowship and shared experience. Even with individual drinks like cider or beer, the practice of treating or standing around was common. If you were with a group of companions, it was expected that individuals would take turns paying for a round of drinks for everyone. This wasn't just about generosity, it was about reciprocity, about maintaining social equilibrium and goodwill within the group. Refusing to accept a treat, or failing to offer one in return when it was your turn, could be seen as unsociable or even insulting. It was an unwritten rule of tavern etiquette, a way of keeping the social gears lubricated with something a bit stronger than just conversation. Taverns were also centers for games and entertainment, much of which naturally accompanied the consumption of beverages. Simple dice games were ubiquitous, often played for small stakes. A few coins, another round of drinks, or bragging rights. Card games, though sometimes viewed with suspicion by more puritanical authorities due to their association with gambling and idleness, were also popular. Some taverns might have facilities for more active games, like a dartboard, though perhaps a more rustic version than we know today, or even an outdoor skittle alley or bowling green if space permitted. And, of course, there was often singing. After a few rounds of cider or rum, patrons might burst into popular songs of the day, sea shanties, folk ballads, patriotic airs, or ribald ditties. Storytelling, as we've noted in other historical contexts, was also a prime form of entertainment, with travelers recounting tales from afar, or locals sharing embellished accounts of recent events. The tavern keeper might even hire an itinerant fiddler or piper to provide musical entertainment on special occasions. All of this created a lively, if sometimes raucous, atmosphere, fueled by the flowing tankards. Another verse of The Lusty Miller of Westchester, lads. A red-faced farmer might roar, banging his pewter mug on the table. And make sure young Timothy here learns the chorus, or he's buying the next round of flip. The tavern was also the quintessential public sphere for the exchange of news and the discussion of important matters, particularly politics. With literacy rates still relatively low, newspapers and pamphlets, when available, would often be read aloud in the tavern for the benefit of all. This would then spark lively debates and discussions, as colonists from different walks of life shared their opinions on the latest pronouncements from London, the actions of the royal governor, or the fairness of new taxes. Drink, in this context, didn't just loosen tongues, it often fueled passionate argument and the forging of political consciousness. Many of the ideas and alliances that led to the American Revolution were first aired and debated over mugs of ale and bowls of punch in colonial taverns. Of course, and with so much drinking, there was always the potential for things to get out of hand. Tavern keepers usually made some attempt to maintain order, though their success varied. Most taverns would have unwritten, or sometimes even posted. Rules of the house. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some surviving examples of these colonial tavern rules include prohibitions against swearing, quarreling, playing unlawful games like dice or cards for high stakes, or telling secrets revealed in drink. There might also be rules about not serving those already visibly intoxicated, or about closing at a certain hour, though this was often more honored in the breach. Fines might be levied by the tavern keeper for certain infractions, or particularly unruly patrons might be ejected, or even reported to the local magistrate. The colonial equivalent of a bouncer was probably just the biggest guy in the room, or the tavern keeper himself if he was a formidable sort. It's also important to note the gendered nature of these spaces and customs. While women certainly consumed alcoholic beverages, and some women even ran taverns, the public taproom was often a predominantly male domain. Women of higher social standing were less likely to frequent the common room of a public tavern unaccompanied, though they might partake in punch or wine at private gatherings or in more genteel inns when traveling. The drinking habits and social expectations for women were generally more circumscribed than for men. A woman who drank too heavily or too publicly might face social censure more quickly than a man would. The extent to which tavern culture in colonial America truly fostered democratic ideals and revolutionary sentiment through open discussion and the leveling effect of shared experience versus simply reinforcing existing social hierarchies and the influence of local elites who often dominated tavern discourse, is a topic of ongoing historical inquiry and interpretation. While taverns were certainly places where diverse groups of men and sometimes women mingled, social status, wealth, and education still profoundly shaped who spoke, who was listened to, and whose opinions carried weight, even after several rounds of rum punch. So, as you imagine raising your tankard in a colonial tavern, remember that you're participating in more than just quenching your thirst. You're part of a complex web of social rituals, of shared experiences, of information exchange, and perhaps even of simmering political ferment. Every toast, every shared bowl, every song sung in chorus was a thread in the social fabric of colonial America, a fabric often soaked in cider, beer, and rum. Just try to remember whose round it is. We've spent many pleasant, sleepy hours now in the warm, smoky embrace of colonial American taverns, sampling a fascinating array of forgotten beverages, the ubiquitous ciders, the rustic beers, the fiery rums, the aspirational wines, the communal punches, the warming flips, the tangy switchels, the creamy possets, and even those intriguing apothecary ales. These drinks were the lifeblood of colonial social, economic, and sometimes even medicinal life. But as you look around a modern bar or browse the shelves of a liquor store today, most of these historic concoctions are nowhere to be found, or exist only as niche craft revivals. What happened? Why did these once popular libations fade into obscurity, becoming mere footnotes in the long, ever-evolving history of what humans drink? The reasons are, as always, a complex brew of changing tastes, technological advancements, economic shifts, and profound social movements. Let's gently explore why so many of these colonial drinks eventually became lost libations. One of the most significant factors was simply changing tastes and preferences. As America grew and developed throughout the 19th century, new beverages arrived on the scene, and older styles began to seem quaint or unrefined. A major shift occurred with the influx of German immigrants who brought with them their lager brewing traditions. Lager beer, with its lighter, clearer appearance, cleaner taste, and greater consistency due to bottom fermenting yeast and cold conditioning, began to gain immense popularity, gradually supplanting the often heavier, cloudier, and more variable English-style ales and porters that had dominated the colonial period. Americans developed a taste for this crisper, more refreshing style of beer, and colonial ales, with their sometimes unpredictable wild yeast flavors or adjuncts like spruce tips or pumpkin, started to seem old-fashioned. The local tavern's special small beer of questionable parentage probably couldn't compete with a sparkling, cold pilsner. The availability and popularity of other spirits also shifted. While rum was king in the 18th century, the 19th century saw the rise of American whiskey, particularly bourbon and rye, especially as settlers moved westward into grain-growing regions. Whiskey could be made relatively cheaply from surplus corn or rye. It aged well, and it developed a distinctly American character that resonated with the new nation. Brandy, too, continued to be consumed, and imported spirits still held a place. But the domestic whiskey industry boomed, providing a potent and popular alternative to rum for many. Technological changes played a massive role. The advent of artificial refrigeration and commercial ice production in the 19th century revolutionized drinking habits. Suddenly, truly cold beverages were widely available, not just slightly cooled ones. This made drinks like iced tea, lemonade, and eventually, chilled lager beer and soda pop immensely popular. Hot alcoholic concoctions like flips, toddies, and mulled ciders, while still enjoyed in winter, lost some of their year-round necessity as a source of warmth and comfort. Why bother with a complicated, hot, eggy flip when you could have a refreshingly cold beer or a proto-Coca-Cola? The very idea of plunging a red-hot poker into your drink started to seem rather, well, archaic, and possibly a bit dangerous if you'd already had a few. Improved water sanitation and public water systems in growing cities also gradually made plain water a safer and more palatable option for daily hydration. While the transition was slow and uneven, The absolute necessity of drinking fermented beverages as a primary alternative to water began to lessen over time, particularly in urban areas. This didn't stop people from drinking alcohol, of course, but it changed the underlying calculus of why and what they drank. Economic shifts also contributed to the decline of certain colonial drinks. The decline of the Atlantic molasses and rum trade in the early 19th century due to factors like the abolition of the slave trade. Competition from other sugar producers and changing trade patterns impacted the availability and price of rum, though it certainly didn't disappear. As westward expansion opened up vast new agricultural lands in the American interior, the focus of farming and beverage production shifted. The apple orchards of New England, while still important, were no longer the sole engine of American drink production. The grain belts of the Midwest became the heartland for beer and whiskey. Perhaps the single most dramatic factor in the disappearance or radical alteration of many traditional American drinking habits was the temperance movement. The temperance movement in the 19th and early 20th centuries, driven by a powerful combination of religious fervor, social reform efforts, and concerns about public health and morality, drastically altered American attitudes towards alcohol, leading to a significant decline in the overall consumption and availability of many traditional alcoholic beverages, and culminating in national prohibition from 1920 to 1933. This movement didn't just target strong spirits, it often railed against all forms of alcohol, including beer and cider. Cider. Once the ubiquitous, wholesome farmstead drink became a particular victim, its production plummeting as orchards were cut down or replanted with sweet-eating apples instead of cider varieties. Many old cider recipes and traditions were lost. Taverns themselves, the very heart of colonial drinking culture, were often portrayed as dens of iniquity. The social acceptability of widespread, daily alcohol consumption, even of milder beverages, underwent a profound transformation. Post-Prohibition. The American beverage landscape was significantly different, with a greater emphasis on lighter beers, cocktails made with a narrower range of spirits, and, of course, soft drinks. Many of the old complex or regionally specific colonial concoctions simply didn't make a comeback. The loss of oral traditions and unwritten recipes also played a part. Many colonial beverages, and especially homemade ones or tavern specialties, were made according to unwritten rules of thumb, passed down through families or from one tavern keeper to the next. As lifestyles changed, as ingredients became unavailable, or as certain drinks fell out of fashion, these unrecorded recipes simply faded away. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some very old taverns or historic family homesteads that have been continuously occupied or meticulously preserved occasionally turn up old account books, diaries, or handwritten notes that contain tantalizing fragments of forgotten drink recipes, offering culinary historians precious clues to these lost libations. It's like finding a faded treasure map, but instead of gold, it leads to a recipe for Aunt Prudence's persimmon wine potent. Handle with care? Assessing the relative weight of these various factors, the temperance movement versus purely economic or technological changes versus shifting consumer taste, in accounting for the decline and disappearance of specific colonial-era beverages is a complex task for culinary and social historians, as multiple forces were often at play simultaneously, reinforcing each other. It wasn't just one thing that made the flip or the switchel fall from grace. It was a confluence of societal shifts that rendered them less necessary, less fashionable, or less available. So, the boring but true reasons for these lost libations are often a mixture of convenience, cost, changing fashions, and major social upheavals. The world moved on, and its drinking habits moved with it. The once bustling colonial tavern, with its unique menu of forgotten beverages, slowly transformed, its smoky, firelit rooms giving way to new establishments, new drinks, and new ways of socializing, leaving only faint, intriguing echoes on our collective palate. Our sleepy exploration of colonial American taverns and their forgotten beverages is nearing its final gentle pour. We've journeyed from the ubiquitous ciders and rustic beers to the fiery rums, aspirational wines, communal punches, warming flips, tangy switchels, creamy possets, and even those intriguing apothecary ales. We've seen why many of these once popular drinks faded into the mists of history, victims of changing tastes, technological advancements, economic shifts, and the powerful social force of the temperance movement. But is that the end of their story? Are these colonial sips entirely lost to us? Mere footnotes in dusty history books? Or do subtle legacies and faint echoes of these old libations still linger, perhaps even experiencing a quiet, curious revival in our modern world? Let's reflect on what enduring tastes and traditions might have trickled down from those colonial tankards. Perhaps the most visible and vibrant revival has been in the world of cider. For much of the 20th century, particularly after Prohibition, true hard cider in America was a niche product, often overshadowed by overly sweet, mass-produced versions. But in recent decades, there has been a remarkable cider renaissance. Craft cider makers across the country are rediscovering heritage apple varieties, those old spitters that were once prized for cider but dismissed for eating, and experimenting with traditional fermentation methods. This modern craft cider movement often explicitly looks back to colonial traditions for inspiration, seeking to recreate the complex, tart, and sometimes funky flavors of authentic, unadulterated hard cider. So, that spirit of colonial self-sufficiency, of turning orchard bounty into a beloved daily drink, is very much alive and fermenting again. Similarly, the craft beer movement has opened the door for brewers to experiment with historical styles and ingredients that might echo colonial practices. While most craft beer focuses on more recent traditions, you will occasionally find brewers creating a spruce tip ale, inspired by colonial spruce beer, or a pumpkin ale that harks back to those early American harvest brews, or even beers made with heritage grains or molasses. These are often niche or seasonal offerings, but they show a curiosity about America's brewing roots. Mainstream historical fact: there has been a significant revival of interest in traditional cider making and craft brewing in recent decades, with many producers looking to historical recipes, heirloom apple and grain varieties, and pre-industrial techniques for inspiration, sometimes consciously echoing colonial-era practices and flavors. In the world of craft cocktails, too, there are definite echoes. Mixologists, always on the hunt for unique flavors and compelling stories, have rediscovered ingredients and techniques that were staples in colonial mixed drinks. Shrubs, those tangy, vinegar-based fruit syrups, have made a significant comeback, valued for their ability to add complexity, acidity, and fruit flavor to cocktails and non-alcoholic drinks alike. You can now find artisanal shrub syrups in many upscale bars and specialty food stores, a direct descendant of that colonial thirst quencher, homemade bitters. Once the domain of the colonial apothecary or tavern keeper, are also a huge trend, with bartenders and hobbyists alike creating complex infusions to add depth to their creations. And the punch bowl, that icon of colonial conviviality, has also seen a resurgence at parties and in bars that appreciate the history and communal joy of a well-made, shared concoction. Even the theatrical flip, with its red-hot lagerhead, makes a rare but memorable appearance at some historically minded cocktail events. A true taste of colonial fire and froth, though usually with modern safety precautions. One hopes, beyond specific drinks, the colonial emphasis on using local, seasonal ingredients and a certain resourcefulness in the face of limited supplies resonates with many modern culinary and beverage trends. The nose-to-tail philosophy in cooking has a parallel in the colonial approach of using every part of the harvest, like turning leftover apple pomace into ciderkin, or finding a use for every available herb and spice. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some historical reenactment groups or living history museums put considerable effort into researching and recreating colonial-era beverages, often non-alcoholic versions for public consumption, or historically plausible and safe alcoholic ones for demonstration or special events, as accurately as possible. This might involve using period-appropriate equipment, sourcing heritage ingredients, and poring over old diaries or account books for recipe clues. These efforts offer a unique sensory link to the past, allowing visitors to literally taste a piece of history, even if it's just a cup of surprisingly tart Switchel on a hot summer day. The authenticity and historical accuracy of many modern revivals of colonial-era beverages, given significant differences in available ingredients, modern apple varieties versus colonial ones, brewing and distilling technology, sanitation standards, and importantly, modern palates, which may not appreciate some of the rougher or more unusual flavors of the past, is a frequent topic of discussion among culinary historians, historical reenactors, and craft beverage producers. It's a balance between historical fidelity and contemporary appeal. Often, what is presented as a colonial recipe is more of an interpretation inspired by colonial practices, which is perfectly fine, as long as the distinction is understood. What can we, in our sleepy contemplation, learn from this exploration of forgotten colonial beverages? Perhaps it's an appreciation for the resourcefulness and ingenuity of people in a very different time, making the most of what their environment offered. Perhaps it's a reminder of the centrality of shared drink in human social life, a tradition that stretches back millennia. Or maybe it's simply a deeper understanding that the flavors and customs we take for granted today are part of a long, ever-changing river of history, with many fascinating tributaries now largely forgotten. The boring details of their daily sips, their tavern customs, their medicinal tipples, all paint a richer, more nuanced picture of colonial life. The tavern itself, as a multifunctional social institution, has changed profoundly. While modern bars and pubs offer places for social interaction, they rarely serve as the post office, the courthouse, the news hub, and the political salon all rolled into one, as their colonial ancestors often did. But the fundamental human desire for a welcoming space, a good drink, and stimulating company remains. So, as we leave the smoky, firelit world of the colonial tavern, let's carry with us not just the names of these forgotten beverages, but a sense of the lives and times they represented. The legacy of those colonial sips isn't just in the occasional craft revival of a shrub or a spruce ale. It's in the enduring human story of finding comfort, community, and a little bit of cheer in a shared cup, whatever its contents may be. And who knows, maybe somewhere out there, a creative soul is even now trying to perfect a truly delicious, non-lethal version of Whistle Belly Vengeance rum. Stranger things have happened in the long history of drink, and with that final lingering taste of colonial spirits and rustic brews, our journey through the taverns of early America gently draws to a close. We've explored the reasons behind their thirst, the ingenuity behind their drinks, and the convivial, sometimes raucous, culture that surrounded them. The clinking of pewter mugs, the hiss of the loggerhead in a flip, the murmur of fireside conversations. These sounds now begin to fade, like the last embers of a dying tavern fire. Let the stories of these forgotten beverages, these unique tastes of a bygone era, settle softly in your mind. There are no more recipes to decipher tonight, no more colonial customs to explore, only the quiet invitation to your own peaceful and well-deserved rest. Feel the gentle rhythm of your breathing, a calm and steady tide, carrying you further from the shores of wakefulness. The world of colonial taverns, with its robust ciders, its experimental beers, its fiery rums, and its comforting possets, now recedes into the mists of history, leaving behind a sense of warmth and sleepy curiosity. Any lingering thoughts are like bubbles rising in a forgotten punch bowl, briefly catching the light before gently popping and disappearing. Your body is comfortable, your mind is at ease. The day is done, and the quiet sanctuary of sleep awaits. Allow yourself to drift into that peaceful space, where history sleeps and dreams are born. May your rest be as deep and satisfying as a long draught of cool cider on a hot colonial afternoon. Sweet dreams.